Michael, this next question is for you. Struggle is not failure. Struggle is not failure, yet some leaders are risk adverse and they simply are afraid of failure. And this really isn't a time for us to hold on to our fear. How can we cultivate an environment that is safe for these leaders who are so fearful of failure so we can maximize our innovation, especially as we're heading into this last quarter of the year?
You know, that's a very good question, because adaptive crises respond to innovation. And that's why the inspiration is so important, because you're now saying, look, so much has changed. So let's reimagine something we thought before. You know, who would have thought so many businesses would have been looking at remote working as a good idea? I mean, it was being touted, people were experimenting with it, but this has accelerated something that happened and made some people reevaluate their position. So I think with the fear thing, I think Thomas has already spoken about some of this so well. Fear of failing is crippling. One thing I've tried to say to my team is, look, mistakes are expensive. So you can't afford not to learn from them, number one. And number two, learn from other people's mistakes. You know, sometimes it's not a bad idea to let someone else pay and then you learn from what they did wrong. But either way, it'll be wrong not to learn from it. So I think the idea of then being open and honest about our mistakes so that we can learn from them, allowing people then to challenge us. And that's why humility, I think, is so important, as Thomas said. Interestingly, Moses is regarded around the world by Muslims, Jews, Christians as one of the greatest leaders who walked on the face of the planet. He's also described as the most humble man who ever lived. So who would have thought humility would have been the key characteristic that marked out a leader of such stature? And it is because then of what you're allowing to come into you and to learn. So I think if we understand that even when we fail, there's the opportunity to learn, to improve. And if it's handled rightly, it can even have a unifying effect in the team. If you're going to go down a path of denial or anger, you're going to split everybody apart. If you're willing to be open and then say, right, what can we learn from this? Stand firm where you need to stand firm, and then acknowledge where you yourself have gone wrong, it's going to set you up better for the next time round. Otherwise, you're going to simply keep repeating the same errors over and over. And that fear thing is really, that is the thing that cripples all of us. And I think we do need to overcome some of the fear that we currently see. Of course, it makes sense to be very careful what we do now. But I saw England's chief statistician on a program who was being quoted by every political party to prove their point in opposite directions. And he did an interview which really made me smile, because he also brought a sense of perspective. People are losing their lives, but at one point he said, how many people are there under the age of 15 in this country? The interviewer didn't know. The answer was 10 million. He said, how many at this point have died from COVID? I think the answer was 2. He then said, how many people under the age of 25 in this country? And the interviewer didn't know. He said 17.5 million. How many have died from COVID? Again, blank stare. He said 34. He said, you need to understand what 34 out of 17.5 statistically, out of 7.5 million means statistically, and how little weight you can put on that. He says, so in an age where people are suffering from anxiety and depression anyway, especially if they're young, some of what we're doing through the media in terms of the message that we're communicating is simply making it worse. So I think that's what Thomas was saying about encouragement being so important. At times when we feel fearful and we're going to make a bad decision based out of fear rather than some other reason, to have someone to encourage us just to take a step back and to try to think about it differently. And at times also to learn to recognize the opportunity in that challenge. That's what a lot of great leadership is actually made out of. And it's a very, very famous story, but the guy who sank, the captain of the Titanic, as we all know, he was chosen for the lack of mistakes he'd made in the past. When he was on that voyage, interestingly, there were multiple attempts from various engineers, radio reports, some other reports about the danger that he could be facing, taking that, and he ignored all of them. And so when you analyze it, remember reading the history of that, I think there were 6 things that were put in front of him, or people tried to put in front of him that he brushed away, that could have averted the disaster. And so actually, at a time of crisis, someone who feels they've never made a mistake or is overly confident in themselves will be humbled whether they want to or not, and sometimes at terrible cost. And that is why I think having humility isn't being weak. I think that we sometimes miss that. Real humility is seen in people who are really strong. That's how you know there's a true humility. There's a strength to their character and their personality and everything else, but they're able to listen and learn and acknowledge where they've gone wrong. Real weakness is when we're so heavily defended, we can't engage in that process. And at that point, we become very poor leaders, and we actually spread the very thing that we're trying to stop. That spreading to other people.
Thank you, Michael. Humility is strength. We need to listen and learn. And the fear of failure is crippling, not to ourselves, but to everybody around us. And I think if I could give one challenge today as leaders, beyond sort of tuting our organization's progress and all of our success and accolades, one of the real gifts that we can give each other during this pandemic is sharing ourselves, so people don't feel like they're suffering in silence, because we're all making those mistakes.
Winston Churchill just said on that point, I remember he very famously said of one of his, Winston Churchill said, that man is very humble and he has a lot to be humble about. And I think that's what we think. It means you're not very good. As I say, real humility is seen in people who have done well, who are strong, who are key. But the reason the humility stands out isn't because they're weak or they failed in that sense. It's because of the way they've been able to handle their strength under control and appropriately. And we love that leadership, and there's a lack of it in this world right now. And it's something I regularly hope and pray for, that we'll recognize in the media how important that quality is within leadership, especially on a global platform.
Oh, thank you, Michael, for clarifying that. And I echo those sentiments. It is so critical, so important, and so needed.